As Bears wide receiver Wendell Davis is running a post route in full stride, the pass is slightly short, so he had to stop and turn to make the catch over the defender. As he planted his foot preparing to turn and jump for the ball, his shoe felt as though it was glued to the ground. With his foot stuck, something had to give. Both his knees snapped as he collapsed to the ground in pure agony. He'd later say he saw a doctor trying to find his kneecaps, and they found them up in his thighs. His patella tendons, which keep the kneecaps in place, had snapped. He'd never play again. And that's just one of the many injuries that was caused by a single invention: artificial turf.
It's AstroTurf.
Artificial turf.
Artificial turf.
Oh, AstroTurf.
Turf versus grass.
Artificial turf.
New questions about the safety of artificial turf.
But despite the devastating injury to Davis, the NFL was slow to respond to the danger of synthetic grass. They'd argue it wasn't dangerous. By the way, if you're new here, welcome. This is NFL Unveiled, and if you like old school, tough football, you're in the right place, because that's all we talk about, and we upload Saturdays at 1 PM Eastern. Developed by Monsanto, yep, that tells you all you need to know, artificial turf, or as their version was called AstroTurf, began rolling out by the 60s. The first pro team to use it was the Houston Astros. When the Houston Oilers moved in 1968, they became the first pro football team to play on artificial turf. Less than 10 years later, by 1976, 16 of 28 teams were using artificial turf. But despite the bold claims from Monsanto, suggesting it could reduce football injuries by 80%, a talking point they quickly dropped, a dark reality was setting in for players. This first generation of artificial turf was a thin layer of material on top of maybe half an inch of foam. Below was just asphalt. So essentially you're falling on concrete. There are reasons why football is played on grass instead of a terrazzo floor on the I-95, and most of them are good ones. They are pretty much the same reasons football should not be played on artificial surfaces. Those scouring pads over asphalt, whose plastic hides are now spread across more than 200 of the football fields of America. No place represented the problems with AstroTurf better than Veterans Stadium, home to the Philadelphia Eagles. Their quarterback, Donovan McNabb, said, "There are two things you can get hit by: our defenders and our stadium." It was said to be an embarrassment to the city of Philadelphia. The stadium was so bad that a preseason game once had to be postponed because the ground was uneven in parts. But the stadium caused far worse than a cancelled game. It literally ended careers. You had Wendell Davis's infamous injury. You also had Bears quarterback Cade McNown, who separated his shoulder after being driven into the turf. Even Eagles weren't safe in their own home. In 1996, quarterback Rodney Peete also tore his patella tendon on a non-contact injury.
For the second straight week, a quarterback gets hurt seriously without getting touched. Perhaps it's the turf.
But it wasn't just injuries to the lower body. As you can imagine, having your head smashed into the ground that's comparable to concrete is dangerous. Michael Irvin's career ended at Veterans Stadium, who after being tackled headfirst into the turf, developed cervical spinal stenosis. Another hit to the neck or head would have been life-altering, so he retired that season. But while Veterans Stadium was certainly the worst in the NFL, any stadium that had turf posed a threat. Take Archie Griffin, a two-time Heisman Trophy winner, who tore his abdomen in 1983 and missed the season. "My foot just got caught in a seam of the turf. I didn't get touched by anybody, and I just went down." Of course, football puts extreme stress on the body, and it can be hard to separate the damage done by collisions, wear and tear, and the ground. It seemed the NFL would lean into this ambiguity, because even though the reality looked bleak, teams still opted to use it, and that's because there were benefits. Back then, many stadiums were being shared with their local baseball team, so maintenance that was previously quite tough, with natural grass, became effortless. If you had an open-air stadium, artificial turf was more usable in various weather conditions, less maintenance was required, it was more durable. But the reality was, if artificial turf was more dangerous than grass, none of that mattered. But the NFL was skeptical of the data, claiming studies that had been conducted offered no proof that AstroTurf was more dangerous than grass. Wait, the NFL not prioritizing player safety? No way. One of the most comprehensive studies was conducted from 1980 to 1989, which concluded, overall, there is a tendency for AstroTurf to be associated with an increased risk for knee sprains and MCL and ACL injuries under very specific conditions. However, it may be that participation on AstroTurf is the most important of all risk factors, or it may be well down the list of importance. In other words, there was no statistical difference between turf and grass. Now, this Sports Illustrated article from 1983 calls into question the legitimacy of the paper. The National Athletic Injury/Illness Reporting System, or NAIRS, who conducted the research, were criticized by many, with one coach saying they just didn't really know what they were talking about. Of course, I'm not a doctor, but I find it hard to believe playing on poorly cushioned concrete floor isn't more damaging than grass. Despite my ill-informed conclusions, and aside from the anecdotal evidence, with countless players getting injured on turf, there were many other studies that contradicted the conclusions of the one I just mentioned. A 1974 study conducted by Stanford found in every category they tested, which was 17, natural grass was safer to play on than artificial turf. An NFLPA study found that 8.7 injuries per game came on artificial turf versus 6.9 on grass. Even the best independent studies confirmed player suspicions. The rate of football injuries on turf was up to 50% higher than on grass. The NCAA also did their own study, analysing 5,500 injuries. Again, the rate of injury on turf was found to be about 50% higher than on grass. There were also other serious injuries like turf toe and infections. Turf toe, I guess the name kinda gives it away, is almost exclusively the result of playing on artificial turf. It's a very painful injury, it's a sprain to the main joint in the big toe, and it forced many players to miss game time and even retire early, like Jack Lambert. You also have burns and cuts from the abrasive surface. You often develop open wounds, and they were so bad, players would wake up the next day and their bed sheets would be stuck to them. But they couldn't just rip off the sheets because that would make it bleed again, so they had to get into the shower and wait for the water to loosen the sheets. Despite all that bad stuff, there was a key benefit. It offered better traction, so when a player made an abrupt stop, the ground didn't give at all. In Hall of Fame tackle Dan Dierdorf's words, you really liked the fact that you could drop back and plant, and your foot was never going to slip. It was sticky and reliable. The 1999 Rams, aka the greatest show on turf, certainly used the ground to their advantage. They went 8-0 at home, and the improved traction facilitated the explosive, aggressive scheme. Coordinator Mike Mart said, guys could come out of cuts and change direction exceptionally fast. It was definitely a factor. But this benefit would also be one of artificial turf's biggest hazards. If you twisted your foot, the ground wasn't going to twist like grass, so your foot stayed planted. But if the ground isn't going to move, something has to. That often meant your knee or ankle. The foot remains stationary, and the joint then takes the load. The traction that some used to their advantage also increased the severity of many injuries. What might have been a sprained ankle on grass turned into something like this, and that's something that's harder for a study to show. So you can understand why players hate it so much.
Our game is founded on grass.
It sucks. No one enjoys playing on it. Everyone's too scared to talk about it.
My knees started hurting when I said turf.
Boy, that
I
turf,
like grass.
boy.
I hate going on turf.
We need to get rid of turf altogether. And I don't want to hear it like it's an indoor stadium.
69.4% of players said they preferred natural grass to any form of synthetic surface. That was a 2010 study, with the new and improved turf they use. Regardless of the NFL's reluctance to give in to players' demands for only grass fields, there would be a slow shift away from first-generation artificial turf. But it wasn't replaced with grass, just a new version of artificial turf. Now this video was about the destruction caused by first generation AstroTurf, but what replaced it is still hated by players. Now the studies here are mixed. A 2012 study conducted by the NFL found knee and ankle sprains were 22% more common on field turf than on grass, and ACL sprains were 67% more common. But then the most recent joint NFL and NFLPA study found that non-contact lower extremity injuries per play were essentially the same on turf and grass in both 2023 and 2021, although injuries occurred at a higher rate in 2022. Generally speaking though, grass is safer for players than any synthetic surface. So if there's any risk, why take it?